For today's film, we're going to be going back farther than usual, back to a pre-classic film from the dawn of the feature-length film. I know it's out of the usual wheelhouse I've established here, but considering we just ran through one of the film's sets, I hope you'll forgive me and that you'll understand why today's film is Intolerance. The story about the story. In 1915, D.W. Griffith changed both cinematic history and American history when he released The Birth of a Nation. Much like the book it was based on, The Klansman, Birth of a Nation is a very revisionist look at the Reconstruction period which followed the American Civil War. It's all about how some heroic Southern family managed to rise up and restore the dignity of the Southern white man after Northern carpetbaggers and Black Americans tried to steal it away. And yeah, Southern white people did suffer for a while thanks to radical Republican policies which were meant to punish Southerners and force integration down their throats. But at the same time, the film wears its racism on its sleeve. One scene shows the black senators of South Carolina eating fucking fried chicken at their congressional seats. Oh, and then there's the part where the Southerners formed the Ku Klux Klan to be a force for justice and order, which it totally was, you guys, trust me. This incidentally inspired the formation of the second KKK, but that's another story for another time. The Birth of a Nation is, rather unfortunately, a cinematic milestone. It was the first American film to use 12 reels, and it pioneered a lot of film techniques we take for granted today, like panning long shots, still shots, night photography, irising effects, and a unique music score which was written for an orchestra. Griffith also tinted different scenes different colors, a technique which Hollywood would later discard when true color film technology showed up. The film was a smash hit. Of course, not everyone was perfectly happy with it. The 1910s may have been the most racist decade in American history, but the NAACP was around back then, and they led protests and boycotts across the nation because of its clearly racist portrayal of Black Americans. Of course, this being the 1910s, nobody listened to them, and the only reason the film started a controversy is because white gangs were using it as an excuse to attack black people. Seriously. The riots, more than anything, led early censorship boards to ban the film in certain cities and states, and the whole incident inspired D.W. Griffith to make his next big blockbuster movie about intolerance. Let me be clear here. If intolerance is indeed meant as any kind of apology, it's the same kind of apology you'd encounter in one of those recent pop music apology songs. You know, the ones where the guy basically says, "I'm sorry, I'm so awesome, and you're such a dingus." That's right, this movie isn't about the people Griffith was intolerant towards, it's about the people who were intolerant towards Griffith. And just so you know, he didn't learn anything about portraying both sides of an argument on equal footing between 1915 and 1960, the year Intolerance was released. So, expect to encounter a lot of very one-sided observations and unfair judgments. So without any further ado, the story. Let me start by saying that my copy of Intolerance was compiled by The Film Detective, and as a result it has tinted scenes and a piano-based soundtrack. This is worth noting because Intolerance is in the public domain, and there are a lot of copies out there of differing quality. Intolerance is a 2-hour movie with 4 separate stories that unfold concurrently, although 2 of the stories are significantly more important than the other 2. Now, I could tell you all 4 stories separately and in order of importance, but that's not how the film presents itself, so fuck it. We're doing this chronologically. The film starts with a shot of the Eternal Mother rocking a cradle. She's used occasionally as a bridging device, but she doesn't do anything, so we'll be ignoring her. The first actual plotline is the modern story. We start with some ladies who are known as the Uplifters and are presumably moral crusaders, prohibitionists, and suffragettes. They want to recruit Miss Jenkins, the unmarried sister of a local industrial autocrat, because she has connections to money. And then the movie outright states that the reason women like her get involved in politics is because they don't have any husbands and they want to feel relevant. Which was a common way to criticize suffragettes at the time, by the way. So at least the movie is upfront about the sort of unbiased truths it'll be presenting. Strap in, kids. Next, we're introduced to Dear One, a young lady whose father works a shit job at the Jenkins mill, but who enjoys her semi-rural life anyhow. Then there's the boy, who also works at the mill. We then cut back to the moral crusaders, who are apparently upset that people enjoy a quiet drink in a bar and sometimes dance in saloons. No mention is made of bar fights or the endemic domestic abuse which caused feminism and the prohibition movement to join forces, but whatever. Old people hate the fact that young people have fun. That's the only reason they're doing this. Then we begin our second story, which is about Jesus Christ. We are told many of the Pharisees were also hypocritical, intolerant old assholes. That is all. Now we cut to the third story, which is set in 1572 France during the Protestant Reformation. We are told that the current king, Charles IX, tends to listen to his intolerant, hypocritical old mother, who hates the Protestant Huguenots, who were the political leaders of the French Protestants before Charles IX killed them all in the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. 3 guesses what this story's about. So, yeah, the queen's a conniving bitch and the king's friends are all effeminate pricks. Moving on, we meet the rest of the French cast, being a mercenary, a man named Prosper, and Brown Eyes, an Huguenot lady who catches the attention of both men. Back in the present, Miss Jenkins agrees to help the uplifters, the modern-day Pharisees. For his part, Mr. Jenkins is unimpressed by the way his employees have fun when they should be sleeping. Finally, we cut to our fourth story, set in Babylon. In 539 BC, Babylon is supposedly at the height of its power. Belshazzar, the city's prince, has fallen for a princess who is also a priestess of Ishtar. Ishtar being a very popular god who made it into a lot of Middle Eastern pantheons, since she's the goddess of love, war, and sex. So, pretty much covers everything. Anyway, the priest of Bel-Marduk, Babylon's patron god, is unhappy with the prince's relationship since it means that his god, and therefore he himself, is losing power and influence to Ishtar. The Babylonian arc centers equally around these politics and also around the wild mountain girl and the Rhapsode, a warrior poet who works for the Temple of Marduk. Rhapsode makes a pass at Mountain Girl, but she throws a rock at him. Presumably her part in the story is to show that D.W. Griffith has no problem with the feminism part of the Morality Alliance, but the whole thing still leaves the taste of ashes in my mouth. I will say this, though. The Babylon story has some goddamn impressive sets, especially for being exactly 100 years old. We next learn that Mountain Girl is in town because her brother is having a hard time keeping her in check, so he's brought her to court. The court sends her to the marriage market to be auctioned off to a husband, which was, at least according to the film, a common practice back in the day. We cut back to the modern arc where Jenkins is having trouble maintaining a profit because of his charitable contributions to the uplifters. In response, Jenkins cuts his employees' wages. And in response to that, the workers strike. In response to that, the National Guard shows up with fucking Gatling guns and mows down the protesters. Dear One, her father, the boy, and a new character, the Friendless One, all flee town and resettle in the Great City. Sometime later, the boy mugs a drunkard out of desperation, and the Friendless One becomes the Musketeer's girlfriend, the Musketeer being a local gang boss. Back in Babylon, Mountain Girl is unhappy about essentially being sold off, and about the fact that no one's buying, but she's saved from the docket when Belshazzar makes a personal appearance and, in the name of Ishtar, gives her a token that says she's free to marry anyone or no one. She falls for him on the spot, but it's more like a crush on a celebrity than anything else. The Rhapsode would have bought her, but he's busy recruiting for Marduk. Mountain Girl stops by while he's working, but she tells him he isn't nearly man enough for her. We're back with Dear One again, who's struggling with adapting to the city. Also, the boy is now part of the Musketeers' gang and roughs people up for a living. The boy sees Dear One strutting down the street and is smitten, but after he tries something, Dear One's father chases him out. Then her father grows sick and dies. Oh yeah, Jesus is a part of this movie. This scene is about how he turns water into wine for a marriage, which was about the most pointed story you could tell in the run-up to Prohibition. Also, this is probably the smuggest Jesus I've ever seen in a film. Then we head back to France, where Brown Eyes and her family are holding a private Bible reading. And now we're back in the city, where Dear One and the boy are on an eye-gougingly fuchsia date at Coney Island, which I guess makes the big city New York. Dear One still won't let the boy do anything personal with her, but then he casually proposes marriage, and she says yes. We cut back to Jesus, and the Pharisees are unhappy that Jesus is having fun. They then try to stone a prostitute, and Jesus says his "whosoever is without sin" line. You know the one. That was short. We're now back with the Uplifters, who have successfully closed all the saloons, and now nobody gets to have any fun. Meanwhile, the boy decides to quit his gang lifestyle for the sake of the Dear One, but when he informs the Musketeer about his choice, his boss frames him for theft as punishment. As a result, he gets intolerated and sentenced to a year in prison. Back in Babylon, the priest of Bel Marduk is still trying to win back public favor, even as he conspires with Cyrus of Persia to take down the city. Of course, the fact that the Persians were so famously religiously tolerant that they ended the Babylonian captivity of the Jewish upper classes is entirely overlooked by the movie. Oh yeah, and black people exist. Well, that was fun. We're back in New York now, and Dear One has a baby. Gender unknown. Dear One goes out to get some whiskey, which was a folk remedy for baby colds back in the day. And when the Uplifters get word of this, they try to take the baby away. Dear One fights back with a broom naturally, so they come back with a warrant to take the baby by force. Oh look, it's Jesus in front of some kids. So the Uplifters take the baby to an orphanage, and we see the nurses goofing off instead of caring for the kids. Now it's France again, and to be fair, the film points out that the Huguenots engaged in massacres of their own in the lead-up to the Royal Massacre, which began on St. Bartholomew's Day. In Babylon, Belshazzar is preparing for the big siege with Persia. Wanting to defend her precious prince, Mountain Girl disguises herself as a soldier and joins the archers on the ramparts. What follows is a spectacle that actually makes the film worth watching. It's seriously pretty incredible. Apparently 60 extras per day were injured during the shooting for the battle. There's even a crazy flame-throwing tank. But to sum it up, the walls hold and the Persians retreat. So begins the extended victory celebration. Back in the present, the Musketeer tries to get into Dear One's good graces by promising to get her baby back, but the friendless one, his girlfriend, grows jealous because she knows what he's really after. Soon after, the boy comes home and hears the bad news. Back again to Babylon, and oh, hello. Now aren't you a familiar set? And a downright frightening number of extras. Belshazzar and the princess are celebrating their victory. Meanwhile, the high priest of Marduk orders the rhapsode to prepare chariots so he can go meet up with Cyrus and betray Babylon. And having done that, the rhapsode, unaware of the betrayal, goes and finds Mountain Girl and brags about everything he knows. Oh hey, it's France again. King Charles IX objects to signing the order to start the massacre, but he eventually agrees after everyone talks him into it. Unaware of what's going to happen, Brown Eyes has a nice evening with Prosper, whom she's recently betrothed, even as someone marks her door with an X. 2,000 years earlier, Babylon is still celebrating. Suspicious of the Mardican priests, Mountain Girl grabs a chariot and sneaks out the gate after them. Now in the present, the Musketeer tries to rape Dear One, but the friendless one is listening in and has a gun and sneaks around the outside ledge even as someone warns the boy, who breaks down the door and starts fighting with the Musketeer. The Musketeer wins the fight, but then the friendless one shoots him, tosses the gun into the room, and flees. The cops then show up and arrest the boy for murder. In the next scene, he's convicted and sentenced to hang. because intolerance. So of course the next scene is Jesus bearing the cross to Golgotha. Outside Babylon, the mountain girl chases the Marduk high priest. Back in the present, a kindly officer investigates the scene of the crime and realizes that the boy might not have done it after all. He decides to take it up with the governor personally, but to no avail. The next morning, the prison staff tests the hangman's rope, and we see how hangings were conducted in many states in the 20th century. 3 men would stand behind a screen and cut 3 strings all at once. One of the strings would open the trap door, and it would be random which one. It's a diffusion of guilt thing. Same reason why, traditionally, one of the rounds in a firing squad is always wax instead of lead. Desperate, Dear One decides to plead with the governor herself. Meanwhile, Friendless One's guilt is eating her up inside. It's enough for her to follow Dear One, but not enough to say anything. In France, the massacre begins. In the present, Dear One is unable to appeal to the governor, but the kindly officer spots Friendless One and finally gets her to talk. However, the governor is already on his way out of the city. In Babylon, Mountain Girl races back to the city to warn Belshazzar. As the boy takes his last sacrament, the kindly officer and company race after the governor's train in a race car marked number 8. If you haven't noticed yet, the cuts between stories are getting more frenetic as the climax approaches, so here's how they all end in order. In France, all the Huguenots die, including the women and children, and Brown Eyes, and Prosper. In Babylon, Mountain Girl gets back in time to pass on her message, but not in time to stop the Persian invasion, and so everybody dies. And for the record, the actual way the Persians snuck into Babylon was by diverting the city's river and sneaking in below the Watergate. In Jerusalem, Jesus is crucified. Surprise twist there. Finally, in the present, Dear One catches the governor's train, gets him to issue a pardon, and stops the hanging just in the nick of time. And then, at the very end, Jesus comes down from heaven to stop World War I, which was kind of a thing that was going on in 1916. The analysis. You may have noticed this already, but I don't have that much respect for Intolerance. The movie has a valid message, it really does, but that message is undermined by its presentation. Ever since I did a review on Metropolis, I've had a few people tell me it's not a centrist message that means everything to everyone, it clearly means only this one thing, and then the thing it means is different in each case. And they're right. That's the great part of an open text. You get a say in what it means that's just as valid as the author's opinion. Intolerance is not an open text. It states D.W. Griffith's opinions on good and evil, and it expects you to like them. And the film seems entirely unaware of this. Look at these people who are intolerant of me. Aren't they horrible people who don't have a valid perspective of their own? Let's all hate them for being intolerant without bothering to understand the motivations behind their actions. If you want to actually end intolerance, you must first discover in what ways you yourself are intolerant of others and try to change your outlook. To reduce intolerance in others, don't oppose them or condemn their opinions because, psychologically speaking, that will only lead them to consider their opinions more valid, not less. You need to prove intolerance wrong by showing that integration can work. Don't just state it like your words mean more than theirs. And you need to prove that everyone is the same by providing minority perspectives that show how we're all just people reacting to different circumstances. Intolerance doesn't show the domestic abuse and the real negligent families that horrified the moral crusaders a century ago. It doesn't show the gang violence that led to harsh law enforcement measures, or the Jewish people stuck in exile in Babylon. Griffith does make good points, and he didn't imagine the mistakes, the indifference, or the smug backpatting he depicts in Intolerance, but because his film is so obviously biased, I find myself less sympathetic to his point of view rather than more. Ultimately, I don't think Intolerance helped anyone, aside from the set designers and the extras of Los Angeles. At the very least, this film employed a lot of people. Thanks for joining me again for today's film review, and I hope you'll join me next time for a noir story about a man who has to solve his own murder. And no, he's not a ghost.